Epilogue Chapter 2 Song had found Captain Alejandro Crack's cabin a haven of elegance and learning. Lined with heavy rows of books and two hung maps, one of the Tribbean Sea, the other of Radiment's reefs, it boasted simple but pristine furniture and a few personal trinkets. Song had always appreciated that so many in the watch disdained luxury, like Tianxi officials. "I must confess Coyle's works have ever been a chore to me," Captain Crack noted as she slid the borrowed volume back into the right spot. "His histories of the unification of Eastleigh are the most reliable, certainly, but those eschatological tirades grow tiresome." The captain was a tall and thick-set woman, with round cheeks and serious gray eyes. She was missing half the fingers on her left hand, bearing intricate wooden prosthetics in their stead, and was nimble enough in their use it was hardly noticeable. Miriam was not nearly so skilled yet. "I find them worth suffering for the lack of Toxtel partisanship," Song replied. The House of Toxtel were the first Istlan kings to unify most of what was now the Kingdom Eastleigh into a single realm, putting an end to the bloody era their scholars called the rule of jaguars. To shore up their delicate position, the Toxtel had undertaken a remarkably sophisticated effort to create a cult around themselves, including arranging for historians to present their rise to power as inevitable and ordained by the gods. It was nigh impossible to find a contemporary work not dripping with praises for the mighty, peerlessly righteous House of Toxtel. Coyle, the third son of a conquered king, had been rather skeptical of this alleged faithfulness and too well connected for the Toxtel to suppress his works. "Besides," Song continued, "has there ever been an Eastleigh work that did not holler about the coming end of days?" Captain Crack did not smile, for she was not that kind of woman, but her stern face was faintly touched by rue. "I suppose if they keep at it long enough they're bound to be correct eventually," the captain said. "I would offer you another pick from my shelves, but I fear you would not be able to finish it." Song immediately straightened to attention. "We are soon to arrive, then. It is my navigator's estimation we will reach Talamanterra by mid-morning tomorrow," Captain Crack confirmed. "We have made good time." A hint of pride in the older woman's voice, not underserved. "Even if they had been lucky with the winds, the Fair Vistas has recently lost a third of its crew to the gloam. To exceed expectations in such a situation spoke to a tightly run ship. I would suggest you prepare your company for arrival," the captain said, and it was not a suggestion. It was a dismissal, and Song took the hint from the very busy woman who had extended her the courtesy of this conversation. She nodded, thanked Captain Crack and retired to the guest quarters. A Brascal had been plotting in a corner with that ever-grinning cook last she saw, which hopefully would keep him and the goddess following him like a playful cat busy for a while still. If she recalled correctly, which she did, Angharad should currently be charming the ship's fighting contingent. Effortlessly and in complete ignorance of what she was doing by being so friendly and polite while wiping the floor with everyone in spars. She even had a way even with the old sea dogs, those that sneered at anyone spending more than a month a year on land. As for the young men, well, Song suspected the Perdiri would be leaving a broken heart or two behind when they departed tomorrow. Mind you, the Tianxi found it difficult to muster sympathy for any boy fool enough to genuinely believe Angharad's eyes kept flicking to the muscled arms of that Istlan watchwoman because she was curious about the tattoos. Song put a spring to her step, lips still twitching at the utterly transparent excuse the noblewoman had gotten out when teased about her lingering eye. With the other two members of her cabal occupied, she was now free to have an overdue conversation with the third. It was to Miriam's door that her steps took her, for she knew it the signifier's habit to retire to her cabin for time alone an hour before dinner. Song was early for that, but with a Brascal and the wind she suspected the pale-skinned woman would have retired ahead of the usual. Song could not blame her. Watchmen were better learned that most in matters of gloam and glare, but Miriam was still stared at by much of the crew even after over a week at sea. Open distrust from strangers wearied the soul, no matter how unearned. Two sharp knocks against the door earned only silence, at least until there was the sound of movement behind the door and Miriam called out asking who it was. "Song," she replied. "I require a moment from you." The Tianxi waited a little longer before the other woman cracked open the door, dark-haired, disheveled and looking somewhat grumpy. Song cocked an eyebrow but said nothing. Though Mariam insisted she meditated before dinner, it often looked like she'd just woken from a nap when she was interrupted. The pale-skinned woman flicked a glance back and forth across the hallway, more out of habit than distrust, Song suspected, and only then opened the door all the way. "Come in," Mariam said. "Mind the candles." The Triglaw moved out of the way and Song entered as bid. All their cabins were the same, the Tianxi had seen when they were assigned, save for a Brascal's which was in a corner and so slightly more cramped. All held a bed, a trunk, a small table with a stool and a worn dresser. Only Mariam had propped up the table and stool in a corner, laid her blanket on the ground and placed candles in a loose circle around it. Perhaps she truly had been meditating, Song mused. "Will this take long?" Mariam asked. "I can't afford to burn my way through my allotment." "It should not," Song replied. Her gaze swept around for a place to sit until she heeded Mariam's invitation to sit on the edge of the bed. The other woman stayed standing, leaning back against her dresser. She was, Song only now noticed, barefoot. Silver eyes flicked over the candles, noticing the faint pale hue to their light, glare touched, all of them. Interesting. She knew little of signifying, as the Epilogue Guild was tight-fisted with its secrets, but she did know it was an art of the gloam and not the glare. "Why use such candles, then?" "We will be arriving early tomorrow," she said. Mariam grunted in approval. "Good, I could do with sleeping in a proper meadow," she said. "I couldn't let down my guard an inch on the Dominion, it's been exhausting." The Epilogue Guild was allowed to hold private land on most watch grounds, Song had learned, in part so that they could build these meadows. Their purpose was obscure, save that navigators rested in them regularly and seemed to count themselves better off for it. "I imagine the navigators will have a shelter house at the port," she replied. "Though it is what follows after our arrival I come to speak to you about." A pause. "There has been bickering." Mariam cocked an eyebrow. "There has," she said. "You should bury the hatchet with Tristan. He's really quite sweet, you know." Song carefully kept her thoughts off her face. Sweet? The man was grenade with a lit fuse. Not once since the scales were ripped from her eyes had Song ever known a god to manifest as often and as clearly as that golden-haired goddess did around Tristan the Brascal. He must be either a madman or halfway to being a saint, though eerily enough he showed none of the usual signs of incipient sainthood. Song's subtle inquiries with some of the Sacramontans during the trials had yielded no recognition for a goddess in the guise of a golden-haired woman in a red dress, which was even more worrying. The easiest way for a god to thrive without being known and willfully worshipped was to have been born of an event so catastrophically momentous it burned in the minds of thousands still. Which meant Tristan the Brascal likely was a madman riding a calamity god, and though Song would not shy from using him she also had every intention of holding him at arm's length until he inevitably got himself and quite a few other people killed. "That is not what I meant," Song said. Mariam thinly smiled. "I know exactly what you meant, Song," she replied. "That was a warning to keep walking. Best you heed it." The Tianxi's jaw tightened. Mariam was usually an agreeable woman. "I understand your issues with Angharad's background, but, no," Mariam harshly said. "You don't. You think you do, and I won't deny the gods dealt your family a hard hand, but you have no fucking understanding of this at all and I will get very angry with you if you ever again pretend otherwise." Song's lips thinned, but she held her tongue. "You are stone-shaped by the chisel of life," she recited. "Will it be your hand wielding the tool, or theirs?" If she gave her anger to others, she relinquished the chisel, and that was unacceptable. Mariam's words were no way to talk to a superior officer, but strictly speaking Song was not that until their cabal was registered. Moreover, her earlier dealings with the other woman had been along the lines of a partnership without rank involved. It would take time for the adjustment and Uncle Shuge had warned her that as a rule hierarchy tended to be played loose within cables. "We have fights enough waiting for us," Song finally said. "Can you, at least, cease provoking her?" Mariam's face closed down like a house come winter, and she knew immediately she had made a mistake. So you've decided to change ships now that you no longer need me, Mariam stiffly said. Fine. Best I knew it now, I suppose. Song stiffened at the accusation. I have done no such thing, she said. Have you had this talk with Tredegar? The Triglav smiled. There was no joy in it. I intended to. That's a no, Mariam cut through. Allow me to be clear, Song. She gets no apology from me for the discomfort of being reminded her people treat mine like chattel. And Stripe candidate or not, you are in no position to make me. Song met her eyes. Her anger was a personal matter but not so a challenge to authority. If that stone cracked there would be no mending it, and Song would not be captain of their cabal in name only. She kept her voice clear, calm, free of anger. Hand on the chisel. A direct order from a captain, she said, is not refused without consequence. There's no ink on paper yet, Song, Mariam replied. And even when there is, we both know that there can be transfers to other cables, without your captain's permission. If I don't stick around, do you think Tristan will? Even one departure might be the death knell of a cabal as small as theirs, Song thought, but two would be for certain. A cabal must count 4 students or be dissolved, and while perhaps one departure could be replaced in time, 2 would cause questions to be asked. If Song stuck with Angharad they would no doubt find another cabal willing to take the both of them in, but that could not be. She needed it to be her name on the reports, Captain Songran, or there was no point to any of this. It was not a threat without teeth, but going belly up now would be the end of her captaincy before it even began. No one obeyed an officer they'd bent. Song measured her words, matched anger to need and found the right stride. She could not slip, not even a moment. You would peddle a murderous street rat with a rampant god and a Triglav signifier who can only use autarkic signs, Song evenly. Do you think it would take me more than half an hour's work to make it so that not a cabal on Talamantara would be willing to touch either of you even with plague gloves on? I can do more than that, Mariam hissed. Not well, Song bluntly replied. Now, let me be clear, I do not want to do this. There is no gain to be had. But if you set out to do me harm, Mariam, I will answer by throwing a torch at every single bridge you've so much as glanced at. She sneered back, but the Tianxi knew it affront. Mariam had reasons to want to attend Choloman's just as urgent as Song's own. Now she had laid out the consequences, made it clear that an attack would be met with worse. She must now make it clear there were no chains, that she was not cornering Mariam either. A house with a lock that only one man may open is called a prison, Master Shijian had written. If you truly want to part ways, I will not keep you. I only require that we proceed in a civilized manner, Song continued. We will arrange a trade with a cabal suiting you and settle the matter without harm to either party. Now to address the accusation. She leaned forward, face intent. I came to speak to you on matters of bickering first because I have known you to be level-headed and because your provocations are purposeful, Song continued. Angharad Tredegar gives offense by accident, Mariam. It does not excuse her, and she is not excused, but it does mean it shall take more than a single polite conversation to begin curtailing the issue. She met Mariam's blue eyes. Do we now understand each other, Mariam Kamov? The two matched gazes for a long moment before the Triglav looked away. I grew angry too quickly, Mariam finally said. And I approached the matter poorly, Song acknowledged. She had underestimated the delicacy of the matter, thinking of the other woman's level-headedness as an absolute instead of a choice. She had broken Zunian, if only by accident. Mariam passed a hand through her long dark locks, letting out a sigh. The other woman looked tired, Song decided. There had always been rings around her eyes, but they seemed darker now. I'll try to refrain from pulling at her tail too much, Mariam said. But if she so much as, I would not expect you to answer an insult with silence, she cut in. Nor will I ask. Mariam let out a noise that might have passed for agreement and the silver-eyed woman decided it would have to do. She rose from the bed, then hesitated a moment. No, it could wait. She nodded at Mariam. But the Triglav frowned at her. Your hand, she said, extending hers. I was not going to ask, Song stiffly said. She was not so thick-skinned as to request a favor after an argument. "I'm still angry with you," Mariam bluntly said, "but not enough to risk your health." "Your hand, Song." The Tianxi cleared her throat, somewhat embarrassed, and gave it. Mariam's fingers clasped her own and the signifier closed her eyes. A moment passed, then Song felt a faint ripple go up her arm, like a shiver, hair-raising and swiftly gone. Mariam let out a long breath, opening her eyes and releasing Song's hand. "The concentration is nearing dangerous again," Mariam said. "Did you purge at all while on the Dominion?" Song's lips thinned. "Twice," she said. "Once during the trial of lines and again after we reached 3 Pines. You might be at a high tide, then," Mariam said. The Tianxi smothered a grimace. "That or the curses were gathering quicker." "Purge tonight," Mariam advised. "The salt in seawater should make you harder to reach, but there's still a risk." Song nodded and gave her thanks. A look at the candles told her that their conversation had lasted longer than anticipated and perhaps to Mariam's material detriment. Song barely used her own candles, given her eyes, so it should be a fitting apology to gift the other woman most of her allotment after dinner. The Tianxi took her leave, briskly heading for her own rooms. There should be time enough for a purge before dinner, though she would look tired afterwards. Still, better to do it early than late. She tended to get nightmares if she did it too close to falling asleep. Locking the door behind her, Song took from her bag a green pouch and a wooden bowl. First she untied the strings on the silken pouch, carefully spilling some of the salt to trace a circle on the floor. She would have to buy more soon, she was nearly out. She would make a note in her ledger. Then came the bowl, a simple wooden piece whose insides were blackened as if sprayed with acid. Song filled the bowl with her water jug, then stepped inside the salt circle and sat down cross-legged. The bowl she set down at her side, and after taking a long breath dipped the fingers of her left hand in the water. She closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. In and out, letting her senses trail off until there was nothing but her breath and the dark. And, after an eternity, there was the smell. Like offal, like rotten hate and shame made into a stick of incense. Song forced herself to ignore it, to focus on the steadiness of her breathing. It was only when her fingers were touching the dried bottom of the bowl that she opened her eyes again. There was not a drop of water left in the bowl, and fresh black scarring from the curses she had purged from her body. When she had been a girl the purge was only needed once every few years, but nowadays it was twice a month. It was getting worse with every season, for an endless sea of hatred and misery was being poured into the gloam by every Tianxi who'd lost to the dimming. By all those lips the name Ren was snarled as a curse, until it had become exactly that. Song slumped, suddenly exhausted, and allowed herself a moment of bitterness at the unfairness of it all. She had not even been born. But only a moment, and then she put herself back together piece by piece. Like putting on formal dress, layer by layer until she was armored against the world. Song was not her brother's, she would not let the weight of duty break her back as it had theirs. Song Ren would wield the chisel and she would win. Come early morning on the morrow they were all sent to their rooms by First Mate Javier, who instructed them to stay inside until told otherwise. Song and Mariam, better learned on the subject of shalomance than the other two, guessed why without difficulty. "We are soon to reach the Ring of Storms, then?" Mariam asked. The tall, exceedingly mustachioed, all-ear Ganon seemed convinced that nailing an entire ferret above their upper lip was somehow distinguished. Officer nodded. "We have the clouds in sight," the first mate said. "Any moment now we'll be hitting the storm front." "Ring of Storms," Abraskal repeated, eyebrows raised. "Now there's an ominous name. Might I ask what it is?" "A Ring of Storms," First Mate Javier drawled back. "There is one encircling Talamanterra, which must be crossed to reach our destination. There's no need to worry, it is barely a mile wide, we have sailed through worse, but obviously we can't have you underfoot during a storm." "Of course," Tristan Abraskal smiled, nodding low. Song's eyes shortly dipped to the golden-haired woman standing by his side, whispering in his ear something that made the man's jaw tighten ever so slightly. The Tianxi wrenched her gaze away immediately, though, for twice now the goddess had almost caught her looking and she would rather keep the details of her contract hidden. As usual, a brascal was a headache. Song breathed out, tightened her grip around the chisel. That was not impartial. The deity's presence was, however, taxing in how it forced her to pretend blindness. It was one reason she avoided a brascal, and why he sometimes irked her more than he strictly deserved to. If at least she could hear the goddess, Song might have a notion of what manner of entity she was dealing with, but for now she could only try to sketch out the deity's machinations through her mortal hand's deeds. "May I request being told when we've passed the ring?" Song asked. "I would not want to miss the sights." "It'll be your first time, won't it?" The first mate mused. "Fair enough, the works are certainly worth a look. I'll see about sending you a man." She duly thanked the officer before he took his leave and they retired to their cabins as ordered. Song had been disposed to wait patiently but found herself restless. She could have gotten ahead in her correspondence, but writing in a storm would only lead to spilled ink and unintelligible characters. She had already folded her clothes twice and checking on her pack one more time held little appeal. If she'd had a book she could have made use of the time, but as things stood it felt like she was throwing away hours. Pacing back and forth did not help. Eventually she sat on the bed she would have remade regardless and made to practice Feng's list. As one of the first scholar diplomats the Republic sent to Malin, and Feng had written several of the definitive texts on learning Amoya. Feng's list was a highly respected speaking exercise, a series of words that helped the speaker learn Amoya's 3 tones and 6 accents. Muthi, Song carefully enunciated, burying herself into the exercise. It kept her mind from drifting until the ship began rocking from the storm. Her voice weakened as her hands tightened against the sheets. What it would feel like, to be a head of cabbage in a cart tumbling downhill? Utterly powerless, at the mercy of a pile of wooden planks held together by nails that, right now, felt all too small. She forced herself to continue Feng's list, and when she finished it to start again. And then again, until the storm passed. She was not certain how long it took, save that however short a span it might have been it had still taken all too long. Yet fairer weather prevailed, and as the rocking calmed there was a quiet knock at her door. The first mate had sent a sailor, as promised, and Song felt so relieved to be allowed out that she had to force herself to wait and remake the bed instead. Hand on the chisel. She climbed to the bridge once she was better composed, finding it wet and smelling of salt but filled with cheerful crew. The crossing must have gone well. The forecastle was nearly deserted, so Song took the stairs up and found a spot out of the way to lean against the railing. The Tiangxi stayed there in silence, savoring the gentle stir of the wind against her hair. The earlier nerves bled out drop by drop, leaving her sagging against the wood until she remembered she was still out in the open. She recognized Angharade by the sound of her steps, which were oddly cadenced. Not sharp like a soldier's or with a sailor's lurching swagger, but something closer to a fencer's gait, light and ever ready to spring into movement. Angharade made a noise upon catching sight of her, then came to join her at the railing. The tall Perduri's elbows came down, coat sweeping back as she put her weight on the wood. Nodding a greeting, which Song returned, the other woman smiled and cast a curious look ahead. The Tiangxi cocked a questioning eyebrow. "You had me curious," Angharade said. "A look at the horizon," then she snorted. "Still do, in fact. It will be hours yet before we reach Talamanterra. What is it that you would look for on the horizon?" "We've left behind the last clouds of the Ring of Storms," Song said. "Soon we should catch our first glimpse of the Grand Orrery." Angharade rocked along with the rocking of the galleon without even noticing, the Tiangxi noted. She envied her that comfort, though not prone to seasickness. Song would never be at ease standing on a rickety hunk of wood surrounded by angry water as far as the eye could see. She found it difficult to understand how seafarers could be so fond of a life where no amount of skill or valor would make a whit of difference if the day's luck decided you were to capsize and drown. "I have never heard of this Grand Orrery," Angharade said. "An antediluvian wonder?" Song nodded. "Some say it is the very reason for the existence of the Ring of Storms, that it tames wind and weather the rest of the way to Talamanterra by pushing out all the wildness onto the ring," she said. I do not know if this is true, but it was described to me as a wonder like no other. The Perduri cocked an eyebrow. Is an orrery not some sort of mechanical map mimicking the movement of the stars? She said. Something not so dissimilar was built on the ceiling above the Trial of Ruins, you might recall. I struggle to believe another such device would be all that exceptional. Sung smiled. You will not struggle long, she said, and a glance at the horizon saw her smile widen. There, we see the first of it. The Tiangsi pointed at a distant silver light near the line of the horizon, Angharade marking the site with a skeptical look. It seems to me you point a star, Song, she said. I do not, she replied. Look closer. The noblewoman did, frowning but trying to understand what she might have missed. It was Angharade Tredegar's willingness to learn that had settled the matter of who she should recruit. The mirror dancer would not entertain the thought that nobility was fundamentally unjust. She did not know the principle of Zunian, that partiality and dignity was a violation of the circle, but that inflexibility did not extend to her actions. Angharade admitted her faults and tried to mend them, a rare thing regardless of birth or what land one hailed from. The troubles with Isabel Ruesta had almost made Sung reconsider her choice, for she would not yoke herself to someone whose every principle bent for a pretty face, but there had admittedly been extenuating circumstances. Besides, the past was now buried. Unlike Isabel, who'd had to do with being tossed onto a campfire. It moves too quickly, Angharade suddenly said. Stars are too far for us to easily grasp their movements, but this one's can be caught by the naked eye. It is not a star, Sung agreed. It is a light large as a man's being moved by machinery. I expect within a quarter hour we'll be seeing the first ring. They stayed together on the deck, small lengths of conversation split by lengths of comfortable silence, as more and more lights joined that first silver pinprick, which grew larger and larger as the ship approached. The sailor in the crow's nest shouted something that sounded like first ring in mangled Antigua, her warning before they got their first real glimpse of the Grand Orrery. Churning white waters came first, and then they saw that from the depths of the Trebian Sea rose a massive circle of gold angled to the side. There were two of them, in truth, with a slight space between. Each was broad as a man was long and slowly turning. It was a sight surreal, seeming more a monster than a machine for all that Sung the truth was otherwise. Sleeping God, Angharade murmured, sound odd. How large is that ring? The diameter should be at least 400 miles long, Sung said. There are several more, all of them orbiting a device at the heart of Talamanterra. As the ship sailed closer, false stars bloomed one after another, gargantuan golden rings moving the great orbs of colored light, blue, silver, green and gold and a dozen colors more, according to some eldritch purpose. Like jewels set in a crown, the lights were shepherded by rings of differing sizes and angles in make. Some were delicate, eerily delicate like steel wire the size of tower, others like thick bands of gold. It was half an hour more of staring in wonder as the crew busied themselves around them before the pair saw their first light up close. The colors were trapped inside magnificently intricate globes of gold and brass, as finely wrought as lace and varied in shape. Some looked almost like spinning tops, others like spheres tightly trapped in bands of brass, and one was but an intricate hollow ring. None were smaller than a great mansion, and all cast their light towards the heart of the device. In the distance lay a massive tower of gears, broad at the base and thinning at the middle only to bloom into an impossibly complex flower of machinery at the summit. Colors flicked inside panes of glass, like storms caught in bottles. The heart of the Grand Orrery, the lights of Sholomance. A wonder like no other, Angharade murmured. You spoke true enough, Sung. Talamanterra is not so great a sight, I fear, Sung replied. But keep some of that out tucked away, as I expect Sholomance will be just as astonishing a sight. She patted the other woman's shoulder and retired, leaving Angharade to stare at the horizon. Soon enough they would be in sight of their destination, and before they did, Tiangsi intended on checking her pack one last time. Sung would not be caught unprepared by what was to come. The man's hair was permanently scruffy, so there was no bed hair to use in telling if he truly napped through the storm or if his clothes were habitually rumpled. One of these days, Tristan the Brascal said, "You're going to have to tell me where you're getting all these maps." "Doubtful," Song replied without missing a beat. Were she a more poetic soul, Song might have mused over any uniform being put on a Brascal's stringy body somehow turning messy as a reflection of his soul's mutinous streak. As it was, instead she fantasized about him being put through a laundry wringer so the rolling pins might iron out every wrinkle and at least some of the terrible ideas waiting behind those gray eyes. Ambushed by the man on her way back from her cabin, the Tianxi had been presented with an unfortunately reasonable request which had let her right back in it, and now to be pressing down the edges of a slip of paper against the top of her dresser. Far from offended, a Brascal's face creased in amusement at her dismissal. It was discomforting how untroubled he seemed by everything, and how closely that matched the Feng Xiangtu's description of a man with rules but no principles. You will know them thus: they neither exalt nor condemn, wandering the land without knowledge of the righteous and unrighteous. Like animals they will feed on benefits and flee calamity, heeding no dignity but their own. Father would have called him a shady bastard instead, which was somewhat less of a mouthful. Song followed a Brascal gaze as he stared down at the sketched map of Talamanteira, little more than sketched lines, and wondered what it was he was looking for. Seen from above, the island looked like a fat-heeled boot inclined slightly upwards. Its southern shoreline ran from the northwest to the southeast in a diagonal cut, all stony beaches and grassy lowlands leading up into increasingly steep hills and finally plateaus, the Ariadnes tablelands, that were a maze of deep ravines and caverns. Near the collar of the boot tall mountains rose, swallowing up about a third of Talamanteira, and atop these squatted the massive silhouette of the Grand Ari's heart. It was in that great clockwork spire's shadow, due south, that lay the hulking shape of Cholomance. The ancient school fed straight into Port Elysée, which covered most of the boot's heel and where the fair vistas was headed. Unless there are farms and the plateaus, that island can't feed itself, a Brascal finally noted. And that port is much too large to still be inhabited. The watch keeps a presence on the island, but it is otherwise abandoned, Song acknowledged. So we're looking at an empty ruin of a port city, a Brascal grunted. That could end either a blessing or a curse, depending on how we play things. Why, Song silently deplored, must it be only this one that showed interest in planning ahead? She would have preferred the quality in another. Once we have registered, our priority should be securing provisions and lodgings, she acknowledged. Then a Brascal could find out who was trying to sell him, Miriam could get that sleep she seemed in dire need of, and Angharade could be sat down for a conversation about how her family's exploits at sea had likely been funded by slave trade gold, and that meant she must watch her words around someone whose kin might well have been sold to fund Tredegar glories. Then she could begin seeing to her own affairs, which were ever too many. Food and a hiding place, huh? A Brascal grinned. Why, Mistress Wren, we'll make a rat out of you yet. Ugh. And to think Miriam genuinely found him charming. There was no accounting for taste. We may not have much time before classes begin, Song told him, ignoring the grin. If so, we will split off to get everything done in time. The dark-haired rat leaned forward, rubbing his chin. Am I getting Tredegar or Miriam? He asked. She would grant that the man was not slow on the uptake. Only a fool would have thought it a sound notion to partner those two if they were to split into pairs. You would be comfortable working with Angharade? She asked. Though strangely enough he looked aggrieved, a Brascal nodded. Good. She had expected those two to be at odds, but they were cordial enough. That Miriam would be half her trouble was a thoroughly unpleasant surprise. I will likely put the two of you on provisions, Song said. We'll see after we dock. Between she and Miriam they should be able to sniff out anything too dangerous while choosing a place to stay. Meanwhile a Brascal would ensure that Angharade was not robbed on prices, and she would ensure he didn't get robbed, period. The street rat nodded, brow creasing in thought. They were finished with the map, so she tucked it away and politely stated they were done with her rooms. Soon they would be inside of Talamanteira, and though Miriam was napping, Angharade would be on the deck waiting for them. A Brascal did not object and they headed up together. She found Angharade on the forecastle earlier and the three settled there, The Sacramontan asked about the Perdurie's experience at sea, as surprised as Song when Angharad revealed it was precious little. Though she had, apparently, been trained to duel on the ship's deck in the bay just beyond her family manor. The trick is to move with the waves, she explained. The footing must be looser than usual. Song did not quite have the heart to explain that her advice would be largely useless to anyone who had not spent most of their life refining the art of war. Abraskal was nodding regularly with a fixed smile on his face, for example. And though Song herself had begun the standard training of Jagong militia at the age of 10, and insisted on being taught the sword as well as the spear, against tradition for women, she would admit to being somewhat lost as well. She had preferred firearms even before her contract ensured she would be a deadly shot. Silver Eyes scanned the distance and there she found what she was looking for. She might not see perfectly in the dark, but she saw at least as well as any darkling. The horizon was not the stretch of black fur it would be to the others. Straight ahead, Song said, drawing Angharad out of some complicated hand movement. We arrive. Her belly clenched in anticipation, for it was on these approaching grounds that her life's work was to begin, but when she first glimpsed Talamantara she found there was no room left for nerves. 100 times Song must have surveyed the worn sketch of a map she had obtained from Uncle Zhuge, but it did not prepare her for the true sight of it in the slightest. It was, she thought, as a drunken scholar's description of the likeness of an island. Rising above the waves Port Elysée with its long, thin stone jetties looked like some city of the dead. Vines, grass and trees had returned to reign when men left. The lights of false stars swept in intricate cycles of colored night and day, slices of silver and green claiming swaths of ruin, while behind the Lickyard city waited the hungry silhouette of Cholomance. Its great dome loomed tall, surrounded by a cluster of lesser ones and towers enough for a dozen cities, all laced with tall arched bridges and connected by strange, winding rooftops. Hardly a light was lit within the ancient palace, but it hardly mattered, for squatting above on tall mountains the grand Ori unfolded like the opened arms of some sky-swallowing god. Lights flickered and roiled, clouds drifting lazily below as its gears turned and turned without respite. Song trusted her own eyes. They were of all the world the only thing she would never doubt, but even staring at Talamantara she could not quite bring herself to believe the island was real. Not until the galleon docked, nestled gently against the stone jetty, and her hand found the chisel again. There was work to do. Epilogue Chapter 3. Before her house's demise, Angharad had only twice journeyed at sea longer than a week. Once while Mother showed her the northern coast on the way to visit their distant kin in House Bethel, the other time heading to the Isle of Selersai. On both occasions she had sailed with House Tredegar's trading carrack, the Swift Alder, which as Mother had liked to tell her was neither swift nor made of alder. Though she had made smaller trips to southern Malin several times a year, in truth most of her time out on the water had been when training her footing had been out on smaller fishing boats borrowed for a day, so Angharad would confess to knowing less of ships than a daughter of Rhiannon Tredegar should. She did, however, know a great deal about ports. It has once been the hope of her parents that the largest town Swarnterlin Hall, Buttram, might be grown into a port to rival Port Cadwine to the south. The town was nestled against what the locals called Tredegar Bay, and what her father had taught her was a natural harbor. Deep waters allowed for easy anchorage, and the promontory of Hare's Rock protected the bay from storms. The smallness of the bay and the lack of good roads to neighboring territories had worked against the town, but both these could be remedied with works. Yet Mother had known that, though House Tredegar's fortunes had risen enough under her stewardship that these works could now be afforded, it was unlikely they would be finished in her lifetime. She had, therefore, instructed Father to see to it that Angharad would be educated in the necessities of a trade port. The noblewoman was not above admitting she had resented the exercise, which had involved much coin counting and squabbling about rights and privileges, men's work. But she had made the bare bones of an effort to learn. It was how she could now look at Port Elysée and decide it was not a very good port. It was, to start, entirely unprotected. There were no breakwaters or land bridges to protect the jetties from the storms, and though that might be forgiven given what Song had said about how the ring of storms kept the elements at bay, the state of those docks was not so easily set aside. The waters here were deep enough the galleon could boldly sail in, but the jetties it approached were nothing but 20 thin, spindly lines of stone jutting out from the city. The causeway they all led into was hemmed in by low walls leading to what appeared to be some kind of overly large customs office. Leaving so little space past the docks, the causeway would be constantly crowded should the harbor be even halfway filled. As things stood, there was only a pair of carracks docked, moored at opposite ends of the jetties. The captain of the Fair Vistas seemed intent on claiming one of the middle jetties, keeping her distance. Angharad eyed the port again and sighed. The Perduri was yet awed by the Grand Orrery's towering spire and looming Sholomance, its towers jutting out like teeth biting into the dark. But the city at their feet appeared to be little more than an overgrown ruin with second-rate docks. "And what sets you to sighing so despondently, if I may ask?" Angharad flicked a glance at the man who'd addressed her. Tristan the Brascal still watched his tongue around her, as the lowborn often did around nobles, but she thought it a good sign he sometimes unbent enough to tease her. She walked a fine line around the man herself, not yet certain of the boundaries. In the world beyond the Watch they would have been kept distant by blood and title, but now they both wore the black. How much did birth matter, once you put on the cloak? She was not yet certain, and so she refrained from offering the man used of her comb even though she had twice said the half-jest on the tip of her tongue over the last week. "Those jetties are much too narrow," Angharad opined, leaning against the railing as they stood up on the forecastle. "It would be difficult to unload large cargo here." The gray-eyed man considered Portalozzi in turn, his stare measuring. Sacromonte was one of the greatest ports in the world still, for all its faded glory, so he should be able to see what she had. Or even just a large amount of it, Tristan finally agreed. "This is no trade port." His words had the woman past him stirring from her quiet doze. "It's meant for defense," Mariam said. "That wall looks short now, but they would have built." The pale-skinned woman frowned, biting her lip. "Ograda od Dalsaka," she said, flicking a glance at Song. The Tianxi asked Mariam something in a language that sounded like Cathayan, but slightly off. Mariam replied in the same, looking relieved, and nodded. "Hoarding," Song translated. "Like a wooden walkway atop the wall, covered by roof and with arrow slits in front." "Arrows? How very century of loss." "The jetties are narrow so few warriors can get out once," Mariam said. "The causeway is small so the press pushes the invaders into the water. This place was built to fight." What a wonder, Angharad thought, Mariam Kamif could speak without adding some sly implication. Perhaps it was Tristan's presence, for she did seem to make something of an effort to curb her tongue around the Sacromontan. The noblewoman debated making an effort at pleasantry with the Triglav but could not bring herself to offer a surfeit of politeness when she was so certain it would be returned by rudeness. "I'm no military man," Tristan noted, "but those walls look to me like any galleon could level them with its cannons from far enough. Arrows would mean nothing." "Talamentara is an ancient land," Song said. "It has been settled since at least Morn's arrival." By which the Tianxi meant the walls had been built in a time before black powder made many once great fortresses into little more than rubble in waiting. "You seem correct in your assessment about the impracticalities around cargo," Song continued. "There is a lighthouse west of here with a beach where some ships were dragged ashore. I imagine that is where the watch unloads what the port does not allow for." Angharad leaned back, trying to get a glimpse of this lighthouse, but they were close enough to Portalozzi now that the orrery lights made it difficult to see beyond their span. In truth, she suspected that even out at sea she would not have seen what Song did, for those silver eyes seemed to pierce through darkness and illusion alike. One of the Fair Vista's fighting contingent, a young man by the name of Emiliano, came to them and shyly passed along Captain Crack's compliments and that they were soon to dock. Which they could all see, but was only polite to convey. Emiliano, tall but hunched over, mostly looked at her while speaking and blushed all the while. Angharad replied politely, as was due, but made sure not to smile. Though she would prefer to think watchmen above such things, it was her experience that young men taken with her sometimes took smiles as encouragement. Such a thing could sour. Should they then try their luck and learn her interest ran strictly to the fairer sex? It was simpler to keep a distance. Our compliments returned to Captain Crack, and my personal thanks for the lending of books, Song replied. The trip was swift and pleasant. We have our affairs in hand and will require no escort. Emiliano tried to linger, but Song's cocked eyebrow was a fearsomely disapproving thing and he was soon routed. Song, Angharade thought not for the first time, seemed comfortable in command. Almost as if she were nobly raised, though of course such a thing would not be possible in Tianxia. Angharade was not certain it was wisest for her friend to lead, regardless of Sholoman's rules, but she would not deny it was a relief for the burden to be on another's shoulders. It would not have occurred to her, for example, to send them all back to their cabins to gather their affairs ahead of docking so they would not get in the way of the sailors as the galleon pulled into port. Her private concerns aside, it was pleasing to have someone with knowledge of the waters they were sailing with her hand on the helm. The galleon skillfully slid into place close by the jetty, where dockworkers were thrown heaving lines to secure the ship. Heavier hawsers followed until the Fair Vistas was pulled tight and tied. A plank was thrown down after, and a sailor saw them out. Angharade was a little surprised at the informality of it, which must have shown on her face. "Something wrong?" Song asked. "I thought the captain would see us off, or at least the first mate," she admitted. Mariam let out a snort from behind her. The sound was unkind. Angharade's teeth clenched, for after weeks of this her patience was waning thin with the other woman. Having been born to a savage land was no excuse for having refused to learn manners since. "We do not warrant such attentiveness," Song said, not unkindly. "We are Sholoman's students, Angharade, nothing more. Captain Crack commands a galleon, a respected position. We are beneath her notice." The noblewoman's lips thinned, but after a moment she conceded the point. She was used to more amiable treatment from crews, as either the captain's daughter or a paying passenger, but she was neither on the Fair Vistas. She was but a soldier under the watch, the same as any other watchman the captain might be ordered to ferry by her superiors. She turned to watch Tristan come down the plank, the man stride on her ear as he bit into what looked like a leathery piece of jerky. Angharade sent him a questioning glance. "Traded for it," he idly said. "Want a piece?" "I will hold out in hope of a decent meal at our accommodations," she replied. "Though I thank you for the offer." "I ever admire optimism," Tristan told her. Angharade frowned, for though this sounded a compliment she could not help but feel she had been made sport of. Tristan the Brascal was clever with words, though she sometimes thought he might be a little too clever with them. The kind of cleverness that led men to get in too deep. Regardless, she was left with no time to spare for thought on the matter when Song took the lead, hoisting her bag and striding onwards towards the end of the jetty. Angharade followed, sailors leaving the galleon in their wake and beginning to organize with shouts. The dock workers, stout men and women that seemed of mostly Learganese stock, paid them little attention as the four walked down the causeway towards the structure flanked by walls she had earlier marked a customs house. Angharade had been wrong in this, as she now realized deeper consideration of the matter would have yielded. The island belonged to the watch and was closed to all others. Who would such taxes be levied on? No, the edifice ahead was something else entirely. It would have been only somewhat accurate to call it a gate, for though it was that, it was also much more. The structure seemed about 100 feet wide and 30 tall, an elegant pale hall on each side supporting a layered rectangular roof of stone. The roof must have been topped by bronze statues, once, but the elements had worn them down to bare bones. It was the wide space between the halls that drew the eye, for 7 pillars filled it from floor to ceiling and each was a delicate wonder. They approached, almost warily, and Angharade's eyes could not help but flick from one to another. Each was exquisitely carved deep gray slate, marked prominently with the colored heraldry and words of a noble house, though she did not see any lineage's name. It took her a shamefully long moment to piece it together. 7 houses, watchmen setting aside noble titles. These were not noble lines but the covenants of the watch. Her steps slowed and she was not the only one. "Which is which, do you think?" Tristan mused out loud. I know mine, Mariam said. It's there. She pointed at the rightmost pillar, where lay a blue crescent moon within a white circle. Angharad found the words of the Akeller Guild ambiguous, beyond the horizon. The academy is in the center, as always, sang Sherrod, tone dry. Its crest was two diagonal yellow stripes across a hand, Angharad saw. Their words were a duty and privilege, though it seemed someone had painted a black line across all the words save privilege and it had only mostly been scrubbed out. The perduri marked the site of a golden tree emblem which must be the Amuthi Society, whose name came from the Amor word for a tree, and its motto of a house of steel. She could hazard a guess at which covenant the green laurel wreath belonged, and perhaps a white quill as well, but her attention was commanded by what must be the Skirati Guild's pillar. Angharad stepped closer and her fingers gently trailed the simple heraldry, cross-silver falchions. She shivered at the words she read beneath. Gods bleed, the militant simply said. The fewest words of any writ beneath the crest, and so lacking in embellishment they felt more like an oath than a boast. She was shaken out of her reverie by Tristan's soft laugh as he stood by the leftmost pillar. What Angharad had thought to be heraldry was only some unevenness in the stone, the pillar's sole imperfection. Going around to join the sacramentan, she saw what he had found. Hidden in the shade of the roof a simple black carnival mask had been carved into the slate. Hunt the night, the cryptia scrawled below. Something about the stillness of the gate, even the halls on the side were empty, all bare stone, straddled the line between reverence and eeriness. It was, Angharad thought, as if they had entered a shrine not to some god but to the watch itself. The spell only broke when she caught sight of movement past the gate. There the causeway continued for a few dozen feet until it ran aground of a squat, square building whose sloping windows were all shuttered tight. Past the building was a crossroads, both sides of which led deeper into portals, but black-cloaked watchmen stood guard by a low barricade in the way. More stood guard before the edifice, and one of them caught sight of their crew beneath the gate. She whistled sharply to catch their attention before gesturing for them to approach. Sung moved first, the rest following. You lot came with the ship that just arrived, I take it? The tall woman asked. She had a Tiangxi look, much like Song, but her accent was so Meshwari. She must have come from those bloody borderlands between the republics and their greater neighbor. We did, Song agreed. Then and you go, ducklings, the watchwoman said, gesturing at the open door past her. Straight to Sergeant Toro, he'll sort you out. He is the one at the desk in the back looking like he could use some sleep. Don't we all, another blastcloak muttered. Fucking double shifts. There was some laughter from the others, and before Angharad could decide whether this was soldier's humor or she should be appalled at the lack of professionalism they were ushered through the threshold. Most of the ground floor was a single room, flanked by wooden stairs to the left and what must be a private office at the back. The great room was a collection of desks, most of them groaning under the weight of paper stacks and surrounded by shelves bearing even more of it. No wonder the shutters were all closed, a single gust of wind in here would mean hours of work. Sergeant Toro was not difficult to find. As dark-skinned as the Milani name had implied, he was perched behind a desk with 4 large manuscripts on it and scribbling on a piece of paper when they approached. He did look like he could use some sleep, Angharad mused. The rings on his eyes were even darker than those around Mariam's, though given the paleness of the Triglaus skin Angharad had wondered if hers were merely faint rings standing out from contrast. The watchman was also, well, small. He could not even be 5 feet tall, Angharad thought, and was slightly built. They stood before the desk, waiting patiently as he finished the last of his scribbling with a flourish, and only then did he look up at them. Dark eyes took them in, then he cleared his throat. Students? He asked. Yes, Song replied. We were told you would sort us out. The small man blew on the paper he'd been scribing, then set it aside and reached for the topmost of the books on his desk. He cracked it open, lines and lines of ink revealed to Angharad's eye, and dipped his quill in an inkwell. I am Sergeant Toro, he said. You currently stand in the gatehouse of Talamantera, which you will not be allowed to pass through again this year save for your test. Do you have your affairs at the ready? His gaze swept through them, earning nods back. "Good," he said. "Now, I must give you a warning. If any of you is not truly a sponsored student whose name is on my list, you are in breach of watch law for setting foot on a closed island. You will be caught, tortured for information and summarily executed." He paused to let his words sink in, leaving Angharad to wonder why watchmen always seemed to threaten execution when she first encountered them. At least it seemed a rote speech for this one, unlike Lieutenant Wen's elaborate pantomime with Sergeant Mandissa back on the Dominion. "Give yourself up now and you will be able to keep your life," the sergeant suggested. The Milani waited a moment, as if to give them the opportunity to confess. Tristan cleared his throat, getting a hard look from Song that he blithely ignored. "Has anyone actually ever given themselves up?" he asked. It would be uncouth to ask, of course, but then Angharad had not. It was purely coincidental her own curiosity would be sated as well. "Good man." One of the garrison recommendations thought it'd be a fun lark to pretend she was, "make a stir," Sergeant Ettore mildly replied. "I hope she had a good laugh, I really do. Good enough it'll carry her through 10 years of serving as a rower on a watch galleass." Only Angharad and Mariam were properly sobered up by that answer. Rowers died like flies, and at times were hardly treated better. In Malin there was such a lack of men willing to take up the role the criminals were used by the Royal Fleet. "I'll need your names for the records," the officer said. "We can handle cabal matters after." Sergeant Ettore was efficient about jotting them down, then blew the lines on the ledger and once satisfied the ink would not smudge closed it and reached for another. "Good, now the welcome speech," the Milani said. He cleared his throat. "There are only 3 rules on Talamanterra," he said. "First, students of Sholomance may not kill each other. Second, the sections of Portalazé marked with red paint are not to be entered. Third, every student of Sholomance must be part of a registered cabal." This, Angharad thought, smacked of lawlessness. The well-born could be expected to behave by virtue of their education, well, most of them anyhow. Infant zones had not impressed her on the Dominion. Still, what was to guide everyone besides nobles here on Talamanterra? Officers, she told herself. Is the watch not an army? It felt like a lacking answer. Sergeant Ettore tapped his fingers against the thick leather-bound ledger without seeming to notice. To elaborate on the third rule, a cabal must be made up of at least 4 students but no more than 7. Anyone who is not in a cabal when classes begin will be placed in one made up of fellow spares as assigned by, well, either myself or Lieutenant Bao depending on who has the shift. I do not recommend this. Song looked about to speak up, but the sergeant raised a warning finger and her mouth closed. A cabal assignment is not permanent, he continued. You may at any time request a transfer to another, and should the request be accepted by their captain you will be added to their rolls so long as it would not bring their number over 7. He leaned. Cabal themselves are not permanent, he continued, for should one at any time have fewer than 4 cabalists its captain will have 14 Sholomance days to recruit back up to 4. If they fail, the cabal is dissolved and its members would be given a grace period to join another cabal. Failing that, they will be assigned to a cabal of spares. He paused. Ren, you had something to say? The 4 of us intend to form a cabal, Song replied. He shrugged. That is your prerogative, and I'll mark it, but first it is mandated that all students should know their rights, Sergeant Ettore said. There is no need to worry if you do not know anyone. Classes will begin in 2 days, but tomorrow all students present on Talamanterra will gather at Misery Square so that they might mingle and form cabals as they wish. His dark gaze sharpened. Regardless of what you may have been told, even by a patron, no student can be compelled to be part of a specific cabal, and any such agreement made before coming here, even if legally binding, is null and void, he said. The purpose of Sholomance is to form a generation of exceptional cabalists, not gild the name of cliques outside these walls. Sergeant Ettore squinted at them. Knowing this, I now ask whether the 4 of you want to form a cabal, he said. Song nodded, Mariam close behind, and after a heartbeat Angharad followed suit. It was Tristan who held them up. I have been told, he said, that should a stripe be part of the cabal they are considered the captain by default? The look sung through him was unkind, but Angharad would admit it was a fair question. It implied a certain lack of trust, admittedly, but to inquire about rules was not outright an accusation. "That's correct," the small man said. "It's considered part of their classes to lead you. You'll get a deeper explanation of how cables function when you meet your school patron, but I can say captaincy is not necessarily permanent. An incompetent leader can be voted out and replaced." The gray-eyed man nodded. "Good to know," he said. "I'm in as well." Sergeant Ettore nodded, finally opening the second ledger. "All cables are registered under a number," he told them. "You will be issued a silver plaque with that number stamped onto it, which serves as your identification and the only way for you to access cabal funds. 3 or 11 might suit," Angharad thought, though the hopes were swiftly dashed. The numbers 1 to 50 were forged in advance, but most students arrived weeks ago, so it is slim pickings left, Ettore said. "You may ask for any number under 100 not already taken to be forged as a plaque, but that may take a few days." Given the warning Tristan had received from his enigmatic mentor, it seemed to Angharad they would have to scrape the bottom of the barrel. "Which numbers are left?" she asked, leaning forward. The small man hummed, thumbing through his ledger. He began at the last page, Angharad saw, but all the lines were crossed on it. On the second there was one free. 44, Sergeant Ettore offered. There was a pause. "No," Song flatly said. Angharad started in surprise at the firmness of the refusal. She leaned closer to Mariam. "Why?" she whispered. The Triglav snorted. "Tianxi superstition," she said. "4 sounds like death," Song sharply said. "It sounds like the Cathayan word for death. Very bad luck. My ears work just fine, you two, and I tell you now I refuse to be the captain of the Double Death Brigade." Truth be told, Angharad thought that Double Death Brigade sounded respectably fearsome, but she suspected that opinion would not be well received. "Surely there must be another plaque left," she said instead, smiling at the watchman. The Milani had been paging through his ledger while they talked and nodded at her words. "One other," he confirmed. "It's going to be 4, isn't it?" Tristan grinned. "No," Sergeant Ettore said. "That one's taken." Song blinked in disbelief. "It is?" The watchman traced the line with his finger, following it to the matching list on the opposite page. "Yes. It was claimed by Captain Tupac, Sergeant Ettore said. A chorus of groans ensued, not the least her own. "Well," Mariam noted, "at least the man knows what he's about." "An acquaintance?" the sergeant asked, openly curious. "We went through the trials on the Dominion of Lost Things together," Song answered. Sergeant Ettore let out a low whistle. "Heard this year was a real bloody mess," he said. "Good on you kids. It'll prepare you better for this place than anything Silver Spoon Free Company princes got up to." He cleared his throat. "Still, there's a reason this one's the other left," Sergeant Ettore said as he presented them the ledger. Following his finger, she saw it was by the number 13. "Ah, Lear Gannon did think that number bad luck," she recalled. "Something about the Second Empire's fall." "So double death it is," Tristan said. Song glanced at him. 13 is a good gambling number, she told him. "What do you have against it?" "First off, there is no such thing as a good gambling number," he firmly replied. "And second, it's the worst possible luck, Song. We might as well just name ourselves those unlucky bastards." Mariam cleared her throat meaningfully. "Women can be bastards too, Mariam," the gray-eyed man amiably informed her. "You're letting us all down, Tristan," Mariam said. "Just gird your loins and call me a bitch." "I'm not going to do that," he replied. The Triglav leaned back, catching Song's eye. "Song, my vote's on 13. There was a pregnant pause as the Sacramontan narrowed his eyes at his friend. "Does it count if I do it on the inside?" Tristan finally asked. Angharad frowned down at him. "It most definitely does," she sternly said. "I will vote for 13 as well, Song." Tristan threw her a betrayed look, but it was deserved punishment. A gentleman should not refer to a lady in such a manner, not even in his thoughts, or if she was not truly a lady at all. Sergeant Ettore, though they were wasting his time, seemed too amused to chide them for it. "You can get a plaque forged," he reminded them. "Anything under 100. There will be no need for that," Sung smiled. "We will take the number 13. Thank you for your patience, Sergeant. It's either this or doing the rosters, so by all means feel free to keep arguing," the small man shrugged. "If there are no further objections, I'll be putting you down for the 13th Brigade." The Milani looked hopeful of another argument, but Tristan sighed and caved in. Twice now Angharad had heard someone call the Kabbalah Brigade, which meant it was no coincidence. "If I may," she said, "why is it that you refer to the Kabbalah as a brigade? I thought them to be, the Watch doesn't use brigade as a name for a military formation as the Kingdom of Malin does." Sergeant Ettore cut her off. "We do have the ranks of Brigadier and Brigadier General, but the first is an administrative rank and the second commands a division, not a brigade." "That seems—" Angharad trailed off, looking for a polite word. "Pointlessly complicated," Tristan suggested. She sent him a disapproving look at the rudeness, however accurate. The small Milani chuckled. "The Watch is built from the bones of older beasts, boy," Sergeant Ettore said. "After the fall of the Second Empire, the wandering bands of rooks called themselves brigades. When the Watch began to gobble them up, the word came along with them, though nowadays it's for Covenanters only." He dipped his quill in his inkpot and began writing their names down. Stopping it, Angharad leaned forward. "Hers? Tredegar," he muttered, then leaned back his chair. "Soaps," he called out. "Look in the correspondence box. Don't we have something for Tredegar?" "Get up and check," a woman called back from the back office. "What's that, soaps?" Sergeant Ettore mused. "Noon and midnight shifts until the end of time, you say?" Rather inventive cursing answered him. There was the sound of someone cracking open a chest and then some ruffling. A mere minute later a rather tall Tianxi, a head taller than Song, who was not short, strode out, braids askew and a pink stripe on her face like she had been resting her cheek against a table. She had a small letter bearing a red seal with the two-tailed snake of House Tredegar, perking Angharad up. "For an Angharad Tredegar," Soaps said, passing the sergeant the letter. "Anything else?" "Plaques for the 13th Brigade," Sergeant Ettore said. "4 of them." The woman stomped back through the door to the back room, but Angharad paid it no mind. The small man passed her the letter, which she cracked open. It was not much, only a few lines. "My uncle confirms he is on his way to Talamontera," she told the others. "He also sent me a gift as congratulations for surviving the Dominion, which he entrusted to the local garrison. I need only go to the appropriate warehouse and show this letter to collect it." "You'll need your plaque as well," Sergeant Ettore informed her. "It should be in the Farrago warehouse even if your uncle's watch, at the left end of Hostel Street, the building made of kiln bricks right before the turn." Angharad inclined her head in thanks. Soaps stomped back out of the back room, returned with a cloth bag she dropped on the table besides the sergeant's ledgers. "I only asked for 4 plaques," Sergeant Ettore said. "So I went above and beyond, you might say," the Tianxi smiled. She retreated, seemingly in a better mood now. The small man sighed. "Take your plaques," he instructed them as he reached for his 3rd book. "I'll see what I can do for lodgings." Tristan's hands were quickest, undoing the knot keeping the bag closed with what Angharad could only call suspicious deftness, and he held it open for the rest of them. Sung reached inside, withdrawing a glint of silver, and Angharad was second. Her fingers closed around a round seal, which she drew out and studied more closely as Mariam went fishing. The silver was rough more than polished. On one side the number 13 was encircled by a sleeping, snake-like dragon, while on the other a thick stripe ran around the edge of the circle with words engraved in what must be Cantor, the mother tongue of Antigua, now spoken only by scholars. She flicked a curious look at Song, who hedged. "It is Cantor from the Union period, which I cannot read perfectly," the Tianxi warned. "That is still more Cantor than anyone else here can read," Angharad pointed out. Seeming pleased, Song flipped her plaque to study the back. Thus, She slowly began to translate. We, they, have learned the secret, mystery, language, maybe, of things that breathe and do not, but with the suffix for being attached. The rest is numbers, but not a number. Thus I have learned the language of all living things. Its name is violence, Sergeant Toro softly quoted. So spoke the harvestman of ruin, toppler of thrones. Tristan choked and Song looked surprised. The sergeant traced a circle against the table, an orthodoxy superstition meant to disperse ill luck. Our school words, the Tianxi slowly said, come from Lucifer. From who? Sleeping God. She could not be serious. For some reason the man seemed to find it hilarious, laughing his fill before wiping his eyes. Ah, youth, Sergeant Toro said, and none quite dared to ask more. Gathering herself, Angharade saw that his third ledger was open and he seemed to have made some notes in the margins while they were looking at the seals. You will be lodged in the Rain Sparrow Hostel, he informed them. A single room with 6 beds. The baths are down the street, if you are so inclined, and all 3 of the taverns on the street will serve you if show your plaque. Before any of them could inquire as to crude necessity of payment, the Milani elaborated. Everything is free until classes begin, he said, but the taverns keep a drinks tally for each brigade and will charge you if you get too expensive. And after the classes begin? Angharade asked. He shrugged. You'll be assigned a patron, they will fill you in as to the practicalities of life in Port Elysée, Sergeant Toro said. Angharade nodded, displeased at the brush-off but aware she was in no place to make demands. I was advised to seek rooms in the Emerald Vaults, Song said. Could something be arranged? The small man snorted. You and everyone else, Ren, only they got here weeks earlier, he said. It filled up 10 days ago. No nice single rooms with a balcony and bath for you. Alas, Angharade deplored. Cheated of the comforts of civilization once more, though at least Song had made a valiant attempt on their behalf. Sergeant Toro scrawled a few words on paper and handed them to the Silverite Tianxi, referring to her for the first time as Captain Song. Good luck, Sergeant Toro told them, and so they were dismissed. They left the office, back to the street, but Angharade stood at the threshold. She thought for a moment she had gone mad, for the world looked like a fever dream, but she had not, everything truly was wreathed in green. The false star above that was painting the world in its color slowly passed above them, leaving a light tinged by gold in its wake. Angharade swallowed. The Grand Orrery's cast had been pale since they left the ship, as if they were under a direct glare, so she had entirely forgot that they were not below a pit. That is going to take some getting used to, Mariam grunted. It even feels different in the ether. Troubled one and all, they put a spring to their step. Though they had not been told of the exact location of the Rain Sparrow Hostel, it turned out to be unnecessary. Hostel Street was not all that long, a mere 10 edifices, 3 taverns, 2 warehouses and 5 hostels for travelers much larger than those Milani law mandated be built by the side of royal roads. They were stone, too, and the facade positively dripping with statues of sparrows hinted strongly as to their destination. By unspoken agreement they decided to first claim the room and set their bags down there instead of wandering about burdened. The Rain Sparrow Hostel was an old mass of worn granite 3 stories tall, its front facade boasting a dozen large double windows facing the street. Between each of these a statue of a hawk, nesting, flying, clawing at the unseen, was fixed, most of them in fine state. The doors were wide open, leading into a tiled antechamber left empty save for a narrow writing desk behind which sat a board glass cloak with a massive ledger before her. Song handed her the paper Sergeant Toro had scrawled on and was met with a raised eyebrow. Toro must like you, to claim a 6er on your behalf, the watchwoman said. I suppose we still have the room, you can have 27. She marked down their names and cabal in her ledger, asked to be shown their plaques and only then went rifling inside her desk to remove 2 small iron keys. Second story, she said. Right end of the hall. Oh, and there's one last thing. She cracked open her book to the last page, unmarked, but there a few letters were tucked away. The watchwoman idly traced through them before seizing on. Tredegar, she said. "You're in luck, you got here in time." Angharad took the offered letter, blinking in surprise. "You seemed quite in demand," Mariam said. The tone made it ambiguous whether that was an insult or not, so Angharad's lips thinned as she opened the letter. Unsealed, and she could see why. It was not private correspondence, strictly speaking. To Lady Angharad Tredegar, "You were cordially invited to an evening at the old playhouse on the 28th of the 12th, for light refreshments and informal company. We." She scanned through the rest of lines, lips tightening as she found the very last. Raising her gaze afterwards, she saw expectant looks waiting. "I have been invited for an evening at the old playhouse," she said. "It appears to be some kind of party." "So why," Mariam said, "do you look like someone just socked you in the stomach?" Just past the end of the paragraph, the part mentioning she was encouraged to bring a guest along, was the names of those who had invited her. Captain Nettle, went one. But the other went Lord Tando. A Milani name. A Milani noble's name. "Apologies, Song," Angharad said. "It appears that I had enemies waiting here as well." Told continued, "Thanks for listening."